Hi, my name is Rachel and welcome to the Art Crew. Today we're going to be going over the biggest mistakes I see people make when they first start out with acrylic paints. And they're things I wish I had known when I first got started. And hopefully by sharing this, it'll make your process go a little bit more smoothly. So let's get started. The three biggest mistakes that I see people make are either using too much or too little water, not creating enough layers, and also using the wrong brush size. The first thing we're going to talk about is water. Now, acrylic paints are a water-based medium, meaning water is one of the ingredients on the list. It also has a pigment and a binder, and the binder is plastic. Now, we want to add water to our acrylic paints when they start to get kind of tacky or when we need them to be more smooth and sometimes more transparent. Now, knowing how much water to use though can be challenging because if you use too much, then what's going to happen is the binder's going to break down and the paints are not going to do what you want them to do. The texture might be different, they might be too see-through, or one of the things I always find incredibly frustrating, when adding too much water, it might literally run down your canvas while you work. So the way to prevent that is knowing how much to use, and I go with the method of a little goes a long way. I start by dipping my paintbrush into my cup of water before touching any paint, and then I wipe off the excess on the side. Then on my palette, I add the wet paintbrush to the paint so that it starts to loosen up, and you'll see that it'll start to go transparent and even the texture will become smooth. From there, I can apply it to my canvas and see if it flows normally or whether or not it is too runny. If it's too runny, then I need to add more paint. If it's too thick still, I'm going to repeat the same process I just did of dipping my paintbrush in my cup of water, wiping off the excess, and then adding it back to the paint that's on my palette. You just want to be careful not to use too much water because, like I said, it can run down your surface and damage the painting in the long run. Some of that comes down to practice and play, which I always recommend doing, but always add at least a little bit of water to your paintbrush before you get started and try to avoid using too much water. More paint is better than less paint. Which leads me to the next mistake I see a lot of, which is not creating enough layers of paint. Now, I tell this to all of my students, and I wish I had learned it a lot sooner, is acrylic paints don't really look good until you have a minimum of 2 layers down. Typically in my own paintings, like the ones behind me, I used anywhere between 3 and 5 layers of paint. And that's just because the more layers you build up, the more complex the piece is going to look, the less you can see that white canvas through it, and it's going to overall feel more finished with more layers of paint. A minimum, I say, is 2, just because if you're using a lot of white, you probably only need 2 layers. But if you're using something that's more transparent, like some types of black or really dark colors can be really see-through, you might have to do 3 to 4 or more coats. Just know that the more coats you use, sometimes the acrylic paints can get less shiny, but you can always fix that with varnish. The last big problem I see when working with acrylic paints is using the wrong brush size. Now, brush sizes are super important with acrylic paints because you do have to work somewhat quickly. Each acrylic paint has its own type of drying time, and the longer it's out, the drier it gets. So working with a large brush allows you to cover areas quickly and return to them while they're still wet, where smaller brushes are good for detailed and more precise areas. And I typically see a lot of students get really frightened by the larger brushes, or maybe they get hesitant because they think they're going to lose some of their details. But because we're going to be doing so many layers, we are going to be able to get those details right in. And so working with a bigger brush allows us to cover our surface quicker, work in wet paint, and it makes the blending process so much easier. And so that's where I see some of the mistakes. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go too in depth in which brushes I would recommend for what task, but if you are interested in seeing more about that, check out my other video on paintbrushes that goes in depth on what the sizes are and shapes and what they all mean. So those are the mistakes that I see, and if you're curious about how to even get started with acrylic paints, or you'd like to know what I use in my own practice, I'm going to drop a link down in the comments section below that can take you to my little free resource on my acrylic painting checklist along with some tips and tricks at the bottom of it. It's free. I just find it helpful to have a little guide to help work through all of this. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm happy to answer anything that comes up. I hope you enjoyed this video and happy painting. I'll see you next time.